Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about legacy planning and the Legacy Project. I'm Vanessa Kanega. I am the President and Director of Content Development for Interactive Legal, and I have the honor of being your moderator and host for this discussion. Joining me today are Chad Reyes, who is a co-founder of the Wealth and Legacy Group, as well as the co-founder of the Legacy Project, and Dan Scott of Scott Law and a co-founder of the Legacy Project, and Jonathan Blattmacher, whose video just disappeared, but he's still with us, I believe. Jonathan is, among other things, the editor-in-chief of Interactive Legal, and is also a principal of Peak Trust and Pioneer Wealth Partners. So Jonathan, let me know that you're still with us.
I'm still with you. I'll get my camera going here in just a moment.
Okay, great. Well, let me just give you all a brief introduction and take care of a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started with the conversation we're going to have today. This discussion really started, at least for me, probably over a year ago in a discussion with Dan, who was a featured speaker at Interactive Legal's Heckerling luncheon. Heckerling is a big estate planning conference every year for those of you, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. And he spoke at our lunch about legacy planning. And we've been having kind of an ongoing conversation about it ever since, and his founding of the Legacy Project. And through Dan, I was fortunate to be introduced to Chad and his wife, Danielle. And we really they wanted to have a conversation about legacy planning and what it means, and really just kind of start the trend and start the ball rolling here. So that's what this conversation is about today. And of course, we brought Jonathan in as a leading expert in the field of estate planning. And Jonathan, I think, as we'll get into a little bit more, has been doing legacy planning for a long time, even if he may not have called it that. So I'm glad to have all of you here with me today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. As I mentioned, there is a handout available. You should see a handouts tab on your GoToWebinar panel. It was also emailed beforehand, but if you did not receive it or you want to download another copy, it's there for you now. And it just has some prompts on there for you to think about that might help as we go along with this discussion. We also will be taking audience questions. We're going to have a little panel discussion here, and then we'll be taking audience questions at the end. And we'd like to have a very free-form, low-key conversations with everyone. So that's really what this is about. So please do send in your questions. Go ahead and submit them on the question panel. And if you will also indicate when you submit your question where you're from, and that's going to be key, because we are actually going to open your mics at the end. If you submit a question, we will open your mic so that you can ask your question live in your own words. So if you will let us know where you're from, just so there's no confusion, I can say John from Ohio, please ask your question. We'll open it up to you at the end. And please don't be intimidated by that. We're all a friendly crew. And like I said, we kind of want this to be an informal discussion. We'd love to hear from you. So please do send those questions in throughout the discussion, and we'll get to them at the end. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump into this conversation. And I don't know who wants to start us off, but I think maybe we should start by just talking about what is legacy planning? What is it? What do you mean by it?
I'm happy to start
Chad?
on that.
Dan.
I think the question that needs to be answered first is really before you get to what is legacy planning, what do we mean by legacy? And because I think in certainly the estate planning world, sometimes the term legacy is used to really only refer to a financial legacy and maybe the idea of generational wealth. We're using the term legacy in a little bit more of a layman's version, where when you think about an individual's legacy, what does that invoke in terms of meaning? I think really, a person's legacy is at the end of their life, what was their life purpose? What did their life mean in that sense? So legacy planning becomes about not just preserving an estate in the sense of assets and focusing on, again, financial or generational wealth in terms of financial assets, but focusing on meaning and purpose and some of those less tangible or human assets as well. And then, as we'll probably get to later, I think once you get over that hurdle and understand the definition of legacy, I certainly feel strongly that the life you live is the legacy you leave. And so legacy planning becomes not just about preserving a person's, the totality of that person's life on death, but it actually becomes about planning forward and proactive planning so that we're working with clients on helping them develop and live the legacies that they ultimately want to leave.
Yeah. John, do you want to share?
Hi. There are various things people do to kind of make sure that their non-financial legacy goes on. I mean, it's the kind of the mores that you try to have your family adopt and carry on. Some people are very laissez-faire about it. My children, my grandchildren can do whatever they want, except I don't want them to live destructive and selfish lifestyles. My firm, Milbank Tweed, had the privilege of representing the family of John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller Jr., when he created the big trust in 1934, and by the way, that's all a matter of public record because it all came out when Nelson Rockefeller was becoming vice president of the United States. In fact, there were more books of what was put in than you could probably put on your desk today. I mean, it was just huge. Everything about the family came out. But one of the things that John D. Rockefeller Jr. said in the 1934 trust was that he was more concerned about his children having more wealth than they could responsibly and selfishly administer than having too little. So he authorized his trustees, if they felt that the existence of that wealth was curbing the ambition, the accomplishment for his descendants, they should take that money and give it to what is now Rockefeller University, which is one of the great institutions in the United States. In fact, that institution was formed when John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought the last working farm in Manhattan in 1901. And it was originally called the Rockefeller Medical Research Institute, but now it is Rockefeller University. And by the way, if you want to go there, because there are 6 teachers for every student, you have to have at least an MD or a PhD even to apply. So it's really an extraordinary institution. And but they set forth that, and they did a lot of other things to try to make sure that their descendants would really be very, very good people. The Rockefellers are probably the first family in the United States. For example, you probably don't know this, but so many national and state parks, over 30 of them, came from donations from the Rockefeller family. When I was in the Army, folks would come down. I was stationed in Fort Lee, Virginia. We would take them down to Williamsburg. And after I'd been there 2 or 3 times, and in those days it was absolutely free, I said, this is absolutely wonderful. And by the way, if you haven't gone there, you really must. It's one of the greatest things we have in this country. And I went to the sign-in place where you first come through, and I said to the woman, who put this all together? And she said, oh, it must have been the federal government. I said, oh, yes. I mean, it's so big, so expensive, must be. When I went to Milbank Tweed, I found out that that was fully funded by the Rockefeller family. Even today, even though they do charge admission fees, most of the money for that wonderful institution comes from the Rockefellers. So they've tried to engender in their descendants a real feeling of community, of doing right by a fellow human being, and by trying to really better the community rather than harm it. I mean, I've represented other wealthy families where it hasn't been so great for the descendants. And that's really something that you can consider. And by the way, you don't have to be super rich to do that. My wife and I, who are not as rich as Chris, Dan, or Vanessa, we have a family creed. And this is the thing I think Vanessa was talking about, where I was really doing something with legacy planning without even calling it that. I used to make clients sit down and prepare a statement on what they wanted to accomplish, especially with their wealth. And I'd give them a starter, but it pretty much became the same way. They want their wealth to be able to allow their descendants to achieve their potential in whatever field they want it to be, whether it's education, whether it's business, whether it's research, whether it's being a missionary, whatever they want to do, they want that wealth to allow them to achieve their potential. But they almost always say, but I do not want to support a decadent and especially a adverse lifestyle. I don't want them to be on drugs. I don't want them to be a burden to their community. Understanding that sometimes people have accidents or they're born with a condition where they have a great struggle. But those are the kind of things that I think about on legacy planning. Chris, Chad, let me pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. You know, when I think of legacy planning, Vanessa, I think that legacy planning, similar to what Dan said, is about the life you live, and then ultimately becomes the legacy you leave. But I had a friend of mine, Rich, who really opened my eyes up, because about 10 or 11 years ago, it took my wife and I on this journey around incorporating legacy planning into our business model. And one of the things that my wife had come to me with, she said she had watched a movie called The Ultimate Gift. And it was a phenomenal movie because it was about a billionaire oil tycoon who ruined his family with the wealth. And then what he wasn't able to accomplish in his lifetime, he was able to accomplish upon his passing. And it really, when she came to me, she said, how do we implement this into our business model? And that just took us on a whole journey over the last 11 or 12 years. And I say that to say this, is that what I've recognized about legacy planning is that legacy planning encompasses 5 assets or 5 capitals, where traditional planning focuses on really 1. And I'll share what I mean. Financial planning or traditional estate planning or insurance planning really focuses on the financial assets. But what I've come to know as legacy planning is really what we call now FISHES, F-I-S-H-S. It's the financial capital, the intellectual capital, your social capital, your human capital, and your spiritual capital. And how do you utilize all 5 of those capitals to impact life like the Rockefellers did positively, but also to lead a life that others can see and recognize? And I think legacy planning encompasses those 5 capitals. And when we can truly plan for 5 capitals, that helps us really put a thumbprint on our legacy and allows us to really be able to impact people positively. So I say this to say is legacy planning is not only just the financial side of it, meaning the trusts we draft, the life insurance policies we sell, and things such as that. It's also how you develop. And Jonathan, we were talking about this, I think, on one of our conversations, and I was sharing how like when we're building a legacy, how many family businesses do we work with over our lifetime? You know, the advisors that are on this call are working with a lot of family businesses. When the founder of that family business passes away, banks are hesitant to even lend anymore because they don't know if the next generation's prepared. So part of legacy planning is also bringing in the social capital. What's my social capital? My social capital is the bankers, the relationships I've made over the years, right? And bringing them as part of the overall planning process so that when I'm no longer there, our children or our nieces or nephews have already been around our advisors, already been around our bankers, so that they don't want to pull their lines of credits. They already have a working relationship. Legacy planning encompasses all 5 of those capitals. And that really, when Rich shared that with me many years ago, my friend Rich, when he shared that, it opened up my eyes to say, most of the time when I'm planning with families up until that point, I was really only talking about their financial capital, not intellectual, social, human, or spiritual. And now legacy planning means, how do you bring those 5 together and really work with the family?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, Chad, I really like this idea of the social capital as part of the legacy. And I was wondering if would you mind sharing the kind of anecdote that you had shared with me and with some of the others, because I think it's a really good example of what you mean by that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you know me, my wife and I and our family is everything to us. And one of the things that we started doing at a very young age, my niece right now, she's 17 years old, but when she was 7 years old, after I started understanding all 5 capitals, one of the things we started doing is we started bringing her around us when we were out at functions, when we were out at events. And I would just do this. I put my arm around her, I give her a kiss, and I say, "That's my niece, so proud of her." And what I was doing intentionally was transferring my social capital to her. She's now 17 years old. If you ask anyone that's around us that know us well, that has been advisors or people in our community, they know who she is because I've literally little by little been transferring my social capital to her. Now, she may or may not come into the business, but if she does one day come into the business, she's not starting and they're saying, "Who is Crystal?" She's starting already having my transfer of capital to her. It wasn't financial capital at that moment, it was social capital. So that's just one example of how when you're building a legacy, we want to be intentional with the other capitals outside of this financial.
Yeah, Vanessa, if
Right.
I may, I think Chad's point about the 5 capitals is one of the biggest ideas around, or most revolutionary ideas in terms of what legacy planning represents, and particularly how it kind of crosses over between professional disciplines. Because at the end of the day, what most estate planners, wealth advisors, et cetera, have in common is that we're dealing with assets. And if we can all start to expand our concept of what an asset is, that it's not just a financial asset, but there are these other assets, human assets, that these are things that not only need to be protected and preserved because they represent the individual's life, but when you talk about proactive planning or planning forward for someone to help accomplish the legacy that they want, right? Goals-oriented investing, these are actually assets you can invest with. So, for example, and it's one of the things we do, at Spotlight. And social capital is an interesting one because when you think about it, when you have a client who wants to get from A to B or A to C, right? Well, some of that might take money, right? In terms of how do you create opportunity? If you look at these other aspects of what you have, social capital is relationship. Well, who do you know, right? How do you navigate the path in terms of managing the totality of your life from an asset perspective to get to the life that you want to ultimately live? And that's the first step. And then when it comes to preserving that life, what we now call estate planning, preserving that legacy becomes not just preserving the financial assets, but creating, reducing those human assets to tangible assets that can be left for future generations and carry forward.
Vanessa, I just want to share this for a moment. I think that where we are right now in the evolution of the industry, whether it be the estate planning or accounting firms or wealth management or life insurance, we started out as a traditional life insurance planning firm and just working with families and helping them acquire life insurance. And what I recognized over time was what they really wanted was not what I was selling. What they really wanted was the things like Jonathan said about how can the family thrive? How can the family make an impact? How can the family make a difference? How can we keep the family together? How can we communicate better as a family? And that's really legacy planning. But it takes, and this is a challenge. The reason why Dan and I and my wife and a few of us on this call really wanted to start this legacy project as a movement was really because families are yearning for this. And a lot of times as advisors, and I've been working with families now for close to 2 decades. And what I've realized is sometimes what a person says with their mouth is not what they mean with their heart. And what I mean by that is we as advisors have to be very intuitive because, I heard a saying, I heard what's his name? Steve Jobs, right? He said something so powerful. He said that he said that if he would have asked, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't Steve Jobs, it was Henry Ford. If he would have asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse and buggy. Really, what they would have wanted was a car that can get them around, and they didn't have to have as much maintenance on it. And I think as we as professionals need to look at the evolution of the industry, and sometimes people want stuff, and sometimes they don't know how to verbalize what they want. And our job as an advisor is to be able to hear what they mean rather than what they say sometimes. And that doesn't mean that we're not listening to what they're saying. We just have to help maybe clarify it. So Mr. Jones, I think what I'm hearing is you want to make sure that the family stays together when you're no longer around. Yes, that's exactly what I meant. They may have not been able to verbalize it. And I think part of my job and part of our team is to help them be able to express what they're thinking and feeling. And sometimes expressing what you're feeling is not very easy with words. Some people, it comes natural to others.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a point that I wanted to get to is, you know, I think this is I think you make a very good point that what people are coming to you for a plan, whether you're an advisor or an attorney, they're coming to you to put a plan in place and they're thinking about their financial assets. But you're right. I mean, what they're really trying to do is reach their goals in terms of providing for their family or protecting a legacy that they've built, maybe if they're an artist or what have you, you know, something that's important to them. But they're thinking about those financial assets when they come to you. So how do you get them in that frame of mind? How do you start that conversation that makes them kind of think, even if you may have to do some of the work, a lot of the work on your end, and really getting to what they want and what they're talking about and what you can do for them to help them achieve those goals? How do you even get them in the right frame of mind to start that conversation?
Is that to me or the panel?
Whoever wants to take it, but maybe, I mean, Dan, I know you and I have talked about this a lot. I think you must have some ideas on this, and how do you open that conversation up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I want to also kind of go back to the point Chad was making about, you know, evolution, because I think part of how you have this discussion depends on who you're talking to. And I do feel like, you know, this sort of evolutionary leap that I think is inevitable when it comes to the industry is part of a sign of the times that we live in. Whereas, you know, the younger generation now, which, you know, I think across trust and estate and wealth management, et cetera, are, you know, those industries are struggling with how to engage with the next generation, the younger generation. And the reality is that that generation particularly tends to be purpose-driven, impact-driven, experience-driven, right? So the values of, let's take the Rockefellers, right? That generation grew up in a time when you built industry and amassed wealth. And I'm not sure how much intentionality there was compared to today when it comes to like the exercise of, you know, mindfulness and some of this wellness movement about intentionality. I think today's generation understands that they can take control of their lives going forward and be intentional and purposeful with building the life that they want to live, which is the legacy that they will leave. And it is about much more than building financial assets, making money, or building wealth, right? It's also tied, and this is where, again, I think this is part of the industry's needing to catch up with current trends. When you think about, you know, the wellness trend, and I always say, I mean, sort of half joking, but I'm serious about it. I think every advisor's job at the end of the day is helping their clients in their pursuit of happiness and human fulfillment, right? If we're not doing that, then what's the point? And when you think about that, and you think about the idea of happiness, this again, current trends, there are studies that have now been done. The study of happiness has become a whole psychology industry. And what we know today is that, you know, is the old adage is true, that money doesn't buy happiness. And one of the results of much of those studies shows that happiness is tied, or the sense of joy is tied to a feeling of purpose. And when a person has a feeling of purpose, they experience happiness. And so this is where, you know, how do we address this with clients? Well, with a younger generation, you can jump right into it, because this is what they want to talk about. They don't want to talk about death and taxes. they want to talk about life and purpose. So it's a very easy conversation to have if we enter the conversation from that perspective. When it comes to an older generation, I usually start to engage, we're typically talking about parents, much of the time, and just kind of relate to, what is it that parents really want for their children, right? Is it the goal of a parent to really hand them a bucket of money? No. I mean, I actually say that generational wealth, to some extent, is a misnomer, because it's not the wealth that we want, it's what the wealth can do. It's the purpose of the wealth. What we're really looking for, in some sense, as parents, is what we want our kids to have, as Jonathan said, and said it very well, right? We want our children to have the potential to achieve, the opportunity to achieve their potential, human fulfillment, right? That all comes back to purpose in that sense. So really what parents are looking for, and what generational wealth stands for, is not wealth for wealth's sake, it's wealth for opportunity's sake. So when you start to talk to an older generation about that, I think they get it pretty quickly. And they can reflect that, a lot of the older generation didn't, even though they may have built a fortune and built a business, oftentimes it wasn't as intentional or as planned as it could have been. It was something that they started out with, they got involved with, and it was successful. And so they relate to the idea of, that, the dreams I had when I was younger isn't necessarily what I'm doing today, even though I'm wildly successful. And they want their children to be able to achieve their dreams, to not get kind of wrapped up in a life that, although providing great comfort and luxury, really didn't result in that happiness in the sense of joy, right? And so I think that's a relatable conversation, and it's a radical one when you start thinking about somebody entered the room to talk about, a will or a trust. But I think very quickly they get it in terms of what you're leaving is not just financial assets. What you have the chance to leave is an opportunity for your children to, if you didn't accomplish it, to live their dreams, to be intentional with pursuing the path that they wanted. And most importantly, this is about the idea that I want my kids to be happy and to have a fulfilled life. That takes strategic planning. That takes protecting the assets and giving them direction, so that they can be applied properly. The other thing I often talk about with an older generation is the old adage of rags to riches to rags, right? The shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. This is something that most wealthy families are familiar with, the idea that wealth is traditionally made and lost in 3 generations. And statistically, it is true. We know today that there's a 70% chance that wealth will be lost by a 2nd generation and a 90% chance that it's lost by the 3rd. And this is not because people don't have wills, trusts, family offices, family limited partnerships, and all of the complex estate planning strategies that have been in place for years. So I can kind of tell a client, again, kind of radically, that if you're coming in for a traditional estate plan, you are setting yourself up for failure, statistically. And so where that conversation goes is, well, what's the solution? And to overly simplify the point about legacy, if you don't give, the value of a dollar is derived from its application, right? The direction that I put that dollar is its power. If I don't give my assets on my death direction and purpose, if I don't build that into my estate plan, I haven't given the asset any direction. And what happens there is it gets pulled apart, it gets argued over, it gets misinvested. And it's that lack of defined purpose and lack of controlled purpose, in my view, that is the biggest reason why that statistic is still true. And those studies showed that what the people interviewed with reflected on were the 2 major issues, I think, were trust and communication, which are, in my view, other ways of really starting to talk about really, putting a process in place to communicate what? Purpose, right? It's not just about, what you're getting, it's why you're getting, right? The focus on why as opposed to what. So that's how I engage both a younger and an older generation typically.
Well, and it seems like it's this is maybe much more of a process than your typical client may be expecting when they walk in the door. So how do you get them adjusted to that mindset of, I'm not just coming to meet with you one time and we're going to put some documents in place and we're done. I mean, this sounds like you really have to get to know the client. It's going to take them some time to figure out what exactly their legacy is and how they want to achieve it and help their family achieve it. I mean, how do you kind of work with them, get them into that mindset of, look, this is a process. We're not going to resolve this in one meeting.
Yeah, Vanessa.
Yeah, Chad.
I'd like to share the first thing I think for advisors that are on here is to not be intimidated by this, because when I first started, I started this doing legacy planning and working with families at this level around 2008-ish, around there. And it was very intimidating because there weren't many people doing it. And quite honestly, I had a mentor of mine who I respect dearly who told me I was crazy to even be doing it. And what happened is I realized that I didn't need perfection. I needed progress. So the first thing I would say to engaging clients in this conversation is we need to be on a journey of progress, not perfection. And the second thing is that legacy planning is really about emotional intelligence. And we're hearing a lot about that word emotional intelligence now, because emotional intelligence, people who have a higher level of EQ rather than IQ make more money, build bigger businesses, and transfer wealth more effectively. It's just studies have proved it. So one of the things that I've done at our practice, and I know we're speaking to the advisor community today, so I want to give them some tangible tools that they can walk away with. The first thing I would say is really start studying emotional intelligence, because the more emotional intelligent we become, the higher ability we have to connect with people and to also understand the words that they're saying, the things that they're saying with the words that they're not speaking. So emotional intelligence gets you to realize if let's say Jonathan and I are talking, Jonathan doesn't need to say something. I can just watch some of his body language. I can watch some of his eyes to be able to really understand what he's really saying. So I think when we're getting into legacy planning, it's not as much as it's check off the box, do this. It's we as advisors need to become more effective at emotional intelligence, because people are telling you and they're speaking all the time, just not with their words. And for me, once I realized that I was on this journey of really understanding people more effectively, it got me to understand that legacy planning is hearing people out. You know, I'm thinking of an advisor that I worked with many years ago, brilliant advisor, technically brilliant, but he didn't hear people. He didn't hear what the person was telling them, because everything to that person was a nail. So when you're a carpenter, you look at a nail, you hit the nail, you hit the nail, you hit the nail. But clients, when they're saying, I want to shrink my estate, I don't know if they really mean that they only want the estate to be shrunk. I think what I'm hearing them say is, I want the people who matter to me and the organizations that matter to me most to get all of my hard work. Now, when that word of I want them to receive everything that I've done and all of my hard work is a lot different than I want to shrink my estate, because shrinking the estate, we could do a tremendous amount of stuff to shrink your estate and we could get it down to zero, but never accomplish your legacy. So
I just want to make it clear, you're talking about for estate tax purposes, shrinking
correct,
the estate for estate
correct,
tax purposes.
Thank you. So I think if we're going to get into the legacy conversation, if there's anything that they take away from what I'm sharing, it's really to become more effective at emotional intelligence, and that'll help us with the conversations we're having. And progress, not perfection. We don't need it to be perfect. We just need to have the courage to have some of these conversations with those clients, because they really are. I've noticed they're craving that conversation, but there's not enough of advisors that are willing to have that conversation.
Well, and I want to touch on that, and then I do want to jump into some audience questions, because we've had some questions, and I think they would start an interesting conversation. So I do want to jump to those. But first, I want to turn back to Jonathan and kind of come to this point of what Chad is making, that people are craving this conversation. And maybe this is a little bit of a critical question, but I'm guessing some of our audience members may be thinking the same thing. Jonathan, you've worked with so many different families throughout your career. do you think that this is a conversation that all of them would want to have? I mean, is this for everyone, or do you think there are some people who really are just looking for that carpenter nailing, taking the hammer to the nail? Do you think this is a conversation you could have with every client?
Well, that's a great question, Vanessa, and I'm not sure you really can. First of all, when you go to an advisor, you know that that advisor wants to make money from his or her relationship with you. I mean, let's face it. Even though I think lawyers and accountants and insurance advisors and others really want to do right by the client, they are in business for their own livelihood, and people understand that. I think that it will vary from person to person. One thing is, I would ask clients in connection with it, what do you hope to accomplish for the rest of your life? Because even though they're there for me to help them reduce estate taxes, perhaps, they're going to live a longer time. And the one thing I can tell you where you will get great pushback, you ought to take all these assets which you've been lucky enough to collect, whether it's 100,000 or 100 million, and give them away because we can reduce taxes that way. You've got to focus on what the client wants. Everybody, including the five of us that are here, we are the number one person in our lives. And you really have to focus on that. Marty Shankman and I have just done a series of webinars, including one of the best estate tax opportunities right now. But the one thing we warn is you are going to get a completely cold shoulder unless you acknowledge to yourself and to the client that having them have access to their wealth to the extent they need it for the rest of their lives is the most important thing in their lives. People come in all the time and say, I care about my kids, my grandkids, my nieces and nephews, and that may be true, but I know they love themselves most, so you've got to take that into account. And the way that I would typically start a conversation is, what do you hope to accomplish for the rest of your life? And that's, very personal. Well, I want to retire at 57. I want to become a great golfer. I want to go to a safari in Africa and then one in India. And you've got to talk about that. How do you plan for it? In fact, one of the things that I began to do in the latter part of my career was to make sure that no matter what happened, the client would have sufficient assets to their wealth that they're more willing to really do good planning. You've got to do that. For example, Chad, I know that when you speak to someone about buying life insurance, you tell them how they benefit from the life insurance, not just, well, if you die, your wife and kids are going to be out on the street, so you've got to buy this policy. That if I were in the business of selling life insurance, and I'm not, I would certainly say, let's talk about how this can benefit you and your spouse during your lifetime, pointing out, for example, some of the income tax benefits of life insurance and how there are really magical things that can be done with life insurance. I think you've got to have that. I think if you just go in and try to give them some fluff about legacy planning, I'm not sure you're going to really get into the client's mind. There may be tremendously wealthy people like the Rockefellers who don't worry about anything else and are really focused on their descendants. But most people I know, even if they seem wealthy to the rest of us, really want to find out, what about me? What about my wife? That will be the number one thing. At least that's my view.
No, it's a good point. Vanessa, so what Jonathan just said is really important for advisors. I think we need to be sensitive to who we're working with at all times, because every person has a different motivational factor, right? So like what motivates Jonathan is different than what motivates Dan or what motivates you. That being paramount, right? The second thing is sometimes we have to go technical. Like so our motto at our firm is tax efficient, legacy minded, family first, because I know that there are certain clients that I know will not get into a legacy conversation unless I can prove to them technically that we can help them tax-wise. Get my point? So as an advisor, that's why I say emotional intelligence is so important, because we need to recognize who we're working with. Like, I'll give you an example. We have a construction company client who we love tremendously, and we've built such a nice friendship and relationship over the years. But he never would have allowed us to talk about legacy planning when we first met him. We had to show him technically, from a tax perspective, what made sense, but knowing that we were going to open up a conversation around legacy, because that's really what I knew he wanted, but he wasn't ready for that at that moment. So we implemented a very tax efficient strategy. He loved it. We got to build a relationship. And then I got to share with him some of the other families that we work with too. And all of a sudden now it's all about significance and not success. So to Jonathan's point, you do need to know who you're working with, because there will be clients that will shut it down, but you need to be, as an advisor, emotional intelligence will tell you who and when and how, because you could say the right thing at the wrong time.
Yeah, and if I could just, one quick point, going back to the original question, Vanessa, about how do you get clients to sort of buy into the process. I mean, I certainly do feel strongly that one of the biggest differences between legacy planning, as I sort of see it and implement it, versus estate planning, too many clients, and I think too many practitioners, with an estate plan, they want to be done, right? They want to say that I got my trust done, my will done, and they get it, they put it in a vault somewhere, and they never look at it again. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that we make, is because your legacy, when you look at it as your life is an organic, living, breathing thing. It's ever evolving. And so we need to find a way, and I'm not saying that there's a one size fits all solution to this, but we need to find a way to create an advisor role, a team of advisors. And I think wealth managers are pretty well positioned. They have an ongoing role with clients. Coming from having been a trust and estate lawyer for many years in the legal industry, I will say that I was increasingly frustrated with conversations with other lawyers where they would insist that law is sort of transactional, which is the idea that you go to a lawyer and you get documents drafted, and that to me was kind of cutting off the idea of an advisor role, which is ongoing. And it's a conversation that's larger than this webinar, but it goes back to business model and finding a way to be engaged with the client. And I do think that a traditional, billable hour model is going to impede that process, because clients don't want to pay $500 to $1,500 an hour, right? They're going to think again before they make that phone call when they think about the cost. And so if we're going to, I think the legal industry in particular needs to evaluate how it services clients, particularly in an ongoing advisor role that incentivizes a relationship. Because when it comes to cost, while I do think, to Jonathan's point, everybody wants to get paid. Most people that I've worked with understand that being fairly compensated is fair, right? I am absolutely willing to pay for a service, when the value I give is the value I receive. So an unwillingness to pay that, to me, indicates the perception of a disparity. Either you're charging me too much, or you're not, or you're not giving me enough back. They're not seeing the value. So I think that gets to the heart of evaluating a little bit how we approach being advisors and the business model we put around it. So legacy planning is not just about the strategies that we use in terms of planning a client's life, but to some extent it could impact business models in terms of how you deliver that service.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and that, I want to start turning to some audience questions now. And I will say some of our audience members have said they don't have microphones, so I may read some of their questions. And I will actually start with a comment, and this comment is from John from Michigan. And I'll start with this just because I think it kind of touches on what Dan was just talking about. He says he's actually one of the people that put up the funding to determine if the ultimate gift could be converted to a movie, and he was one of the extras in the movie and has been doing this since 2000. And he basically says that the acceptance of this type of planning is slow because of what Dan was talking about, that it takes time and commitment to develop a legacy plan, and that it's not just one visit to an attorney's office, and that those that wait until they've generated their wealth often lament that they needed to start it much younger. So I think the point there is just that to the extent, I think he makes the point about Chad's story about his niece, and that to the extent that you can kind of transfer, I guess, not just the social capital, but the importance of this to people at a younger age, the younger generations, they'll get this concept and start their legacy planning much sooner. So I just wanted to share that. And John had another question that I'll actually share here in a moment, because I think it's
Can I just chime in
a
on
good
that?
question to ask sort of at the end. Sure. Yeah.
I just want to make an interesting point there, because I 100% agree. And I think it sheds light a little bit on the intention behind this movement. The slow adoption of a sort of new way of doing things is a challenge. And what we're hoping to accomplish here, is that there's strength in numbers. And if clients will quicker adopt the next level of planning if that becomes more of a standard, right? To Chad's point about Ford and wagons and cars, if I'm selling cars and you can still go buy a wagon, and that's where your mindset is, maybe that's all, you can't wrap your head around the car yet. Maybe you think you don't need it. And so if as industries, as professional advisors, we buy into the idea that planning is not just about financial resources, but it's about life and purpose. And that's the huge added value that we can bring in, the opportunity that we have to really change people's lives and make an extraordinary impact ourselves on the world. If we buy into that, then the clients will buy into that.
Yeah,
If we're front.
And actually, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do just want to, we had a series of questions from somebody that I may not be with us anymore, but if he is, I would like him to chime in, actually, if he could, because I think he's making an important point. Barry from Boston, are you still with us? Give him just a moment. He may have dropped off, and if he did, then I can, okay, yeah, Barry's left, but I can kind of summarize his point. And I'm sorry that he's dropped off, because he had submitted a couple of comments that were sort of making the point of this conversation has really focused a lot on people's higher net worth, right? We're not focused on the high net worth tax planning so much, but it's still revolved around people who have a lot of assets, a lot of wealth to transfer. And those are not the clients that everybody that's listening to this conversation represent. So I think his comments were really getting to the point of how does this conversation relate to maybe your more average or your more middle class client and people who serve them? And I'm hoping you could maybe respond to that.
Yeah, Vanessa, I'd love to field that one, because legacy planning is legacy planning. I think Jonathan said that whether you have $1, or I think you used $100 million or $100 billion, whether you're the business owner just getting by, or you're Jeff Bezos building a multi-billion-dollar global corporation. Legacy planning is legacy planning. The problem becomes, and this is where I see it, the problem becomes is that if we're going to have these conversations, when we're working with clients that don't necessarily have that net worth that we're typically working with, the issue becomes is how do you get compensated for your time? That's the question. Because I'll give you an example. If we have a client and we're managing $100 million of their assets, well, it's kind of easy to know how you're getting compensated for that, right? Whereas if it's a client that you only have $200,000 of their assets, how do you do that? The one thing I'll say is, Vanessa, is this: it's a business model issue, not a legacy planning issue. And this is what I mean. A business model issue is, how do I incorporate this, but it doesn't have to take me tremendous amount of time. Whereas when you're working with a family that's worth $1 billion, you can give a lot more time because there's a lot more capital that can be exchanged for your value. But I know advisors that have integrated some of this into their conversations, and they're working with the average family that's, the family that has $500,000 of assets to a couple of $1 million of assets, right? And they have their primary home and some retirement accounts. It's not as much can you use this conversation? It's how do you build your business model so that it can be sustainable enough to allow you to have these conversations and you can be profitable while still having them. And that's a business issue. That's not a legacy issue, in my opinion.
Wow, yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Dan, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, one of the things I've described, and again, I don't think we profess to have all the answers on this call, but I've always used the example, I'm going to sort of paraphrase Elon Musk in talking about the Tesla, right? Any sort of new development, new technology, it starts with state of the art. It starts out with the expensive model, and then eventually you build into efficiencies that, you create the Model 3 or whatever it is to be more affordable. So I do think, you have to start with, what does it look like? I mean, you need to start by adopting the principles and then work towards a cost-efficient business model, as Chad pointed out. The other thing I think it is, and this might be getting a little bit more technical than we're ready for, but I identify in a legacy plan what I call legacy assets. Those assets are, those which reflect the purpose of the individual, as opposed to assets which maybe don't, right? So the used car you have in your garage may be meaningless, and it's just something it's just an asset versus a legacy asset, which is more meaningful. When it comes to planning for sort of the average Joe, right, where there's not a great amount of financial assets, perhaps legacy assets in those scenarios take on a more sort of sentimental form as opposed to financial. So things like encouraging clients to, write their story or do something that another way of communicating that life purpose and recording it and passing it on. I haven't done any of that yet because my client base tends to not be there, but I am working on some solutions through some other strategic partnerships I have. But I think that's the answer, is what a legacy asset is changes. Whereas for wealthy families, $100 million and up families, very often a legacy asset takes the shape of, say, a family office or a family business or something like that, or some type of trust structure, right, where we can infuse values and the human capital, right, into a legal asset.
Yeah.
So that's my thoughts on it.
Vanessa, just before we jump into the next question, for those that are on this discussion, next month we're going to be having a friend of mine and Dan's who's going to be joining us, and he has a whole technology platform that allows you to do this with clients, and it allows you to leverage the ability to have these deeper conversations through technology so that you don't have to do it manually. So I'm encouraging everyone to jump on next month, because we're going to be speaking with my friend Roy, who has this software platform, and that can be used for the family that has $500,000 of assets to $3 million or $4 million. But it could also be used with the family that's billionaire family. Like one example is it's a owner of a major sports team. They own multiple sports teams. They have 65 family members. This software allowed them to be able to bring it all together on an online platform. Well, that could have been done with the same person who's worth $1 million, and they have 3 or 4 of their children that are in different parts of the country. It's technology that allows us to be able to utilize this, and next month we're going to talk a lot more about that.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thanks, Chad. I think that
we're going to be very innovative in terms of, once legacy planning is adopted, then we'll be innovative about how to deliver that service. But I think we're still working on the state of the art.
Yeah, well, and I think, as we know, as being the president of a technology company, as we would say, the technology leads to efficiency, which I think gets to Chad's point before about it being part of the business model as to how do you make it efficient to have these conversations. We have a gentleman named David who's asked a couple of questions that I'm gonna try to summarize into sort of one question, and then we have a question from Lloyd from Oklahoma who I'd like to have ask his question live using his mic if we can. So just giving you a heads up, Lloyd, if you have a microphone available, I'm going to turn to you next. But if I can try to summarize the questions we've received from David, I think it's basically a matter of, this is all great. This approach to planning is all great, but your best plan is only as good as its implementation. And this takes a lot of coordination, and I think he called it interdisciplinary coordination. How do you make sure that the plan the legacy plan you're building is actually implemented?
So I'm just going to share from my experience over the last 11 years. The first thing, Vanessa, that I've done in our business model, my wife and I, is we have our message either repel or attract advisors. That's the thing, because people like Jonathan and Dan, they get it. They understand that working together is so much more important for the family than it is trying to do separately. So the first thing I would say is when you're working, you need to work with advisors and team members and people that you work with who actually like to play well in the sandbox, because that's the benefit of the client. The benefit of the client is you take a guy like Jonathan, he's brilliant. I mean, technically brilliant. And you put him in a room now, and you put him in with a brilliant accountant, and you put him in the room with Dan and myself and you, Vanessa, and now we get to brainstorm what's possible. Is mind-blowing. But if we take a guy like Jonathan and we put him in a room with people who are so narrow-minded, it eliminates and reduces his brilliancy. So I would say it's so important to choose the right advisors that you're working with. Like, there's been so many advisors, accounting firms and law firms that I've had conversations with. And I just had a conversation with a gentleman that's on this call today. And I had a conversation with him last week, and I said, I'm at a point in my career where I only want to work with advisors who want to really collaborate, not advisors who want to show how smart they are. Because you being smart does not mean that you're helping that client. It actually can mean you're hurting the client. I need advisors that are brilliant and want to work well together so that we can really come up with something that's better. And my wife said this all the time. Andrew Carnegie, or many people know him as Carnegie, right? He came up with this idea of the mastermind. And the reason being for the mastermind is because when you bring multiple people together, it creates this mastermind, a mind that's bigger than all of us together. And I think when we're working as advisors, we need to find advisors who really want to bring their minds together. And that's where I think magic happens, that's where impact happens, and that's where the clients get served the best. And that's where the interdisciplinary. In the earlier part of my career, I was working with advisors, accountants, attorneys, who really didn't care about helping the client, or if they did, they didn't know how to work with each other to help the client. And I think part of the evolution of your business model, the advisors that are on this call, is finding advisors who really get it. Find advisors in your community who get it, work with them, talk through it. And what's possible is so much bigger there than you trying to do it on your own. I don't know if that helps that, David, answering David's question, but that's it. It's collaboration with like-minded individuals. It doesn't mean they have to believe everything that you believe, because I know Jonathan, we don't 100% see eye to eye on everything, but I know Jonathan is there for the benefit of the client, and we can have deeper conversations so we can kind of hash out how to help them.
Well, and Jonathan, coming back to you, I mean, I know from working with you in practice that you would often use a lot of tools for sort of implementing plans, checklists and having regular family meetings with some of the bigger families. I mean, do you think that some of those tools could be applied to this type of legacy planning as well?
Vanessa,
Jonathan?
I think it certainly can. Oh. Yeah, Vanessa, I think it certainly can be. I've long believed that you're better off, having a group together, and, you guys can meet outside of having the client. You meet with all the people who are going to provide services. Let me mention one thing that I'm aware of, which worked out extremely well. There was a lawyer in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, named Jerry Levan. He was a good lawyer, a good guy. I liked him very much. And he had members of a certain man's family come to him and say, look, we've tried to get the head of the family. They had a relatively successful family business to do some planning, but he's always too busy. He's never going to die, all sorts of excuses. Well, Jerry invited him to come in, and the guy came in and he basically said the same thing. I got plenty of time to do the planning. I run this business. It's my life. It's very important. After 6 months, Jerry finally got him to agree to see a psychologist. And the psychologist really worked with him about what was important. And finally, the guy did the planning, and he did it very well. He didn't live for a tremendous amount of time thereafter. He thought he had 20 years, and he lived about 2. But Jerry actually formed a company in which he had the entire team under one roof. He was a lawyer, but he had a psychologist on staff. He had a nurse on staff. He had an insurance person on staff. He had an accountant on staff, and he had a wealth advisor on staff, at least to coordinate, to kind of captain things. And I sent a number of families to him. And Jerry said, I don't care what they're worth, but if they have enough money to care about and enough to try to keep things in the family going well, that's important. One of the things we know is that relationships among siblings, and especially among cousins, tends to break down. And I can assure you of one thing. If you have a client and say, would you like a significant portion of your wealth when you die to wind up going to the lawyers because there are fights among your heirs when you die? Everybody says, well, of course that's what I want. I'd love to see my money go to the lawyers. Of course not. But that's one of the things that you can talk about to them. And that means, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do if your son and daughter, or worse, your son and your sister's husband, that dread in-law, decide to make trouble? In fact, Vanessa, I think you know the answer to this question. I've asked it so many times. What's the difference between an in-law and an outlaw? Outlaws are wanted.
Outlaws are wanted.
Outlaws are wanted. So when you sit there and talk about things, when you talk to people, you've got to bring out these real world things. And I'm telling you, your clients will absolutely love it. One of my wealthiest clients, whom I'm very, very close to, and I've saved the family probably $2 billion in taxes. But he said to me once, the most important thing you did was to put in all our trust, that the child or grandchild for whom the trust was created all the way down the line could participate as a beneficiary and have a power to continue a portion of the trust for their spouse only if the child entered a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement that was adequate to protect that child and the family from the other person whom they were marrying or to whom they were married. They absolutely loved it. And it's very, very important. You know, about half of American marriages wind up in divorce, and even many of those that don't wind up in divorce, there's tremendous strain. And think about all the blended families where, you know, a man and a woman meet, or two men meet, or whatever it is, and there's a child from a prior union. How do you handle that? That's a really important thing to people. And you've got to talk to them, and that's part of what is good. You can call it legacy planning or whatever, but it's one of those things that has to really be taken into account, I believe.
Well, we're running out of time, as always happens, and I want to make sure we do get some more audience questions if we can, to the extent we can. So, Lloyd, are you available? Do you have a microphone? Can you lob in your question?
My microphone is green and not red. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, actually, Jonathan really kind of touched on my question, but the panel may have other thoughts to add, because my question has to do with the fact that I've always heard and I've come to believe in my career that people.
Lost you.
I think we may have lost you, Lloyd. Are you still there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. Hopefully we won't have connection problems. So in that vein of understanding that people like to talk about themselves, my question had to do with the panels. What your experience tells you are good questions to ask that are probing and tend to elicit from the client the topics that they care about, the things that if you figure it out and talk about it at the end of the meeting, they're going to say, boy, that guy's brilliant and that conversation was valuable. We need to do more of this.
Yep.
Good question. Yes, it's maybe some more concrete kind of questions to open up that conversation. Thank you, Lloyd.
Probably forgive me, Vanessa, for attacking on, but Jonathan mentioned a psychologist and other professional disciplines. Us being able to discern the best questions to ask, the ones that are truly going to be effective. Because, honestly, I might have a client that's got lots of money and we could discuss all kinds of sophisticated things. But if the very most important thing to them is what happens to their dog, they're probably going to pay me whatever I ask if I value talking about their dog.
I'll jump in on this one and give you an answer, although it's a little bit limited in its scope because of the type of client. But I do a lot of work with creatives, and so in terms when we talk about legacy and purpose, a lot of it has to do with creative vision or sort of the root of their creativity, which is no different really than kind of getting to what an individual's purpose is. So what we do is a combination of things. One is to make things more efficient. In our intake questionnaire, we actually speak to those human assets, intellectual capital, spiritual capital, social capital, and then what I call individual capital, which is intended to really sort of represent your what makes you tick as a human, sort of your passions and things. So right off the point, they're engaged with some of these deeper questions in terms of listing out a handful of from each category in terms of what they're interested in or what they're qualified in or what some of their core values are. But then in terms of in client intake process, with every single client, and this is not necessarily time efficient, so we would probably need to come up with a more efficient solution for some smaller clients. We actually just have them tell us their story. I mean, we literally sit and in a client's words, we want to hear how you got to where you are today. And obviously having a little bit of a sense of who the individual is already going into that conversation. And the reason that's so important, one, Lloyd, to your point, they talk about themselves and they love it. Particularly creatives love it that much more. So it's really sort of an engaged conversation. And then what we do in this practice, and this is a skill that maybe others would have to learn, but we pick up on the function of that is we get the individual to essentially reveal what they consider the plot points in their life. And so those plot points become important when it comes to core values or things that have developed their personalities. And so we're able to sort of, flag those and get into deeper conversations about some of those. And that engagement, that level of engagement with the client is something that they've, never experienced before. And it is engaging, right? They're oftentimes moved. I've had clients actually end up in tears having had these conversations. So it's a very intimate, revealing conversation that talks about issues that people inside care about deeply, are often uncomfortable to volunteer, but enthusiastic to share once you actually start to extract that information.
Yeah. So Lloyd, I have one question that I use, and I use it in different variations. But the question is, if time, money, and tax laws was not an issue, what would your picture look like if you could draw it and none of those things were a problem?
Right.
Because what I found is that a lot of people don't understand tax law. A lot of people don't are limited by what they have from their perspective. But if I really can get people to dream and just tell me what they want it to look like, I'm sure Jonathan, Dan, myself, our communication coach, our legacy coach, I'm sure we can all figure out how to make that picture. But a lot of the times, the questions that we're asking are not getting people to share what they really have. So your question was phenomenal, because I think that if time, taxes, tax law, and money were not an issue, what would you want it to look like ideally? And then you shut up and listen and let them tell you, because people have vision of what they want, but they don't think it's possible because they don't know how to do it. My goal is not to limit them to how to do it. Just tell me what that vision looks like. Dream again. And then I'm sure As long as you're not asking me to do something that's illegal, I'm sure we could figure this out.
Yeah, Chad, to your point, we take, it's one of the questions essentially on our questionnaire, but the word that I use is impact. So all things being equal, if you can, what would be your, what impact would you love to have on the world? What's your sort of dent in the universe? And that to me, when we just talk about, I want to steer a client away from maybe going somewhere material, right? So, if money weren't an issue, I'd be living on a paradise island somewhere. And a lot of times, I think clients go immediately to sometimes a material outcome, which we know is not a solution when it comes to happiness. And so I try to steer them towards what impact would you want to have, and that particularly is engaging. Again, when we talk about next generation, the younger generation, they are impact driven. And so that's something that is a really engaging question.
Very interesting. One thing, I don't know where this goes, but one thing I noted is that Dan and Chad, your approaches are sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum, right? That Dan, you kind of start with where have you been? Tell me how you got to where you are now. And Chad, yours is more forward-looking, saying, if none of these things were, if you didn't have these constraints, where would you want to go in the future? And so maybe that's all part of the same conversation is how did you get here? And okay, now that we understand that, where do you want to go? And maybe all of that helps to draw out what's important to the client. Yeah. All right. Well, we have so many more questions, and unfortunately, I think we have to draw to a close. So there is one other question that somebody posed that didn't have a microphone, and so I'm just going to ask it. But I think it's a good question that will kind of help maybe some people who ask questions that we didn't have time to get to. Somebody noted that you have Legacy Project webinars planned for the upcoming months. And they simply asked, where is this going? Where is this conversation going? And Chad, I know you talked a little bit about the plan for next month's webinar, but if you could maybe talk in a broader concept, broader terms about where this conversation is going.
Yeah, so appreciate that, Vanessa. I think it's important for each person that's on here to know that this is a conversation and movement. That we're not asking people for money. We're looking for advisors who want to have these conversations. And you saw before on the screen there was community, conversation, and collaboration. So what we're planning to do is we're planning to do once a month something like this, different topics every month. It'll be a little bit different, so that each advisor that's on there will be able to take away something different. Open it up, similar format to what we did today, open it up at the end for some questions. But it's conversations, and I would encourage you that if you have advisors that you work with that you think this conversation around legacy would be impactful, invite them. You will, one of the things that we're going to be doing, Vanessa, like I mentioned to you, is you'll be, being part of this now, you'll be on our monthly list. And you'll get the link every month for you to just join, and it'll give you a link. I think it's 5 days, a day or two before, and then an hour before. So you could click on it. But it really is around a conversation around legacy, and we're going to continue to refine this. Dan and mine, and I'm sure Interactive Legal at some point, our goal is eventually to bring these to cities and have these conversations in your local city so that you can be working with advisors that are thinking like this, because the purpose of it is to empower you to want to do this in your local community. And that's really where we're going. That's where our heart is. But things can change, because this is not something that we're looking to make a tremendous amount of money on. It's something that we're looking to empower and equip advisors to have these conversations with their clients.
And one other question actually that was posed specifically about Chad, your fishes model. The person had asked if there was any additional material or a place they could read more about that. And I would just like to ask in general, if people out there, and the questions and comments, I have to say thank you to everyone who's sending questions and comments, because they show a lot of engagement and it shows this is really hitting home for a lot of people. If people want to read more about this, about the fishes concept in general, or just, the fishes concept specifically, or just legacy planning in general, do you have resources you could point people toward?
We do. So on the website, the Legacy Project website, I'd ask for people to be patient with us because we're just starting to really start posting it. But what we're going to be doing, Vanessa, as you're well aware, you, Matt, and your team at Interactive, because you guys were very involved in that, we're going to be posting articles consistently on there all around these concepts. So you just want to keep checking in on that website because there'll be articles on there around communication, around legacy, around family governance, around all the things that we need to help serve families. And we're going to be using that as the reference point. So there's a blog section of it that will have all those different articles on there. And there's many of them that are on there right now, but we will continue to update that as time goes on.
Wonderful. All right. Well, and I don't want to put you on the spot. We didn't talk about this beforehand, but I'm going to put you on the spot. If people have questions, if there are questions we didn't get to, or they have additional questions they think of, is there a way people can reach out to you?
Dan, you want to go?
Email. Yeah, email is great. Is our email posted anywhere?
No.
In the materials?
You know what? I don't know, actually. How about we say this? You know what? I'm sure that people will be able to reach you eventually through the Legacy Project website. So I think that's probably a great place to point people toward, is the Legacy Project website for additional information. As Chad said, it's going to be kind of a conglomerate, congregating site for information and additional resources. And I'm sure there'll be a way eventually to reach out to you through there as well. So I think that's probably where we should leave that.
Yep. I will say this, that if anyone has any questions, when the email goes out as a follow-up to this month's Legacy Project conversation, they can also reply back to that and be able to start a dialogue with any of us.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Well, with that, we'll wrap things up. And I just want to say thank you again to all of our panelists. It was a great conversation. And thank you to like I said, to the audience members who asked questions and posed comments. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. If I didn't get to your question, I'm so sorry, but we just ran out of time. But please, join the group next time, continue to come to the monthly conversation, because it's clear that this has really sparked a good ongoing effort, and really hit home for a lot of people. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Vanessa, for moderating. Good job.
Bye.
Take care, guys.
Good job, Jonathan.
everyone.